I will show you a little bit of my work, some selected pieces, a little bit of an introduction. All my work deals with the relationship between language, between words and images. I've been working in visual culture from the very beginning of my work, and from the very beginning as well, I related images and words in the 90s and late 80s when I started to be an artist. And my first work was basically a visual approach to words, and then the words came into the images and became part of the artworks. So when I recently participated in a workshop at Princeton University about the itinerant language of photography, which was based in a visual correspondences, which is an essay we also made with other artists about a visual conversation between us and to check how far we could go exchanging purely visual material between us, how far a dialogue could go. Who organized this seminar at Princeton wasn't a photography or an art department, but a language department that wanted to understand how much language, their body or their issue to work on, is changing as a consequence of the irruption of photography in everyday communications, particularly in the new generations where images are becoming essential in communication, and that is changing at a speed that was never anticipated. So we as photographers, the people that have been working with visual culture for all our lives, on one hand have less of a job, because being a photographer, everybody's a photographer. So, and stock agencies, that is what I lived for 30 years are over, and everybody wants the pictures for free. On one hand, it's very difficult to survive as a photographer. On the other hand, photography and images and video are more important than ever before in language and in culture at large. So this is the introduction, and I will somehow show a body of work that goes along these changes, the changes of the incorporation of visual culture into language and how they interact. So I will show you first my work of the 80s, which is called precisely Words. And then we'll go to Good Memory. So this is just an introduction, no? An introduction of how I dealt with words. This is somehow referring to the School of Mechanics of the Navy. That's where the torture happened in Argentina during the dictatorship, and that's where my brother was killed. So this is also somehow referred to torture. Indirectly, the images have the power to tell things indirectly, so you can take them however you want to. It's not one interpretation. That's an emergency of books. That's some kind of Argentina. Okay. Camera and eye. This is interesting because the relationship with the eye is very present today in Latin America because of the Chilean insurrection and the fact that 340 people lost their eyes as a consequence of the repression. So this was my first approach to the river. In the river that gives us our name, we are called Rio Platenses in Spanish because we live beside this river, as you do beside Lake Ontario, and that gives us our name. And it is into this river that the victims were thrown, as if here they were thrown into Lake Ontario. That certainly won't happen. You don't need to fear of that. This is a family picture. Okay, this is, so this is, okay, this is like to see, a help call. This is an indirect. So then we go to Good Memory. Good Memory is 1996. I come back from living in Spain for 15 years, like from exile and working there, already with something organized in the life. And I decided to get together with my classmates to see what they were doing when I came back to look for the roots. And so I was taking these pictures of my classmates. In front of the picture that we took in the first grade when we were together at being 13 years old, in the first class of the high school. So these are, for instance, this one is here. Okay, these are the different classmates. And at this time, this was 20 years of the coup. We decided to, the fear comes into the body fast, but it leaves slowly. So 20 years after, it was the time for us in the school to remember how many were the victims of the dictatorship. So at that time, we decided to create a memorial, to do a memorial event and read the names of the victims, which we didn't know how many there were from our school. We counted them. There was an event. And for that event, we had a picture, an exhibition of photographs, basically of the families of the missing, showing how they were, their poems, their lives, their drawings, something about each of the missing from the school. And in order to participate in that exhibition, I had this backdrop of my portraits, and I wrote in it what had happened with each of my classmates. So this is me here a few years ago. And in the red circles, we have Claudio and we have Martin, that are the two victims. Martin was like my close friend of the time. He didn't get to know his son, Paulo, who is now like 40 years old. And this is the picture I took of Martin when we were teenagers, or even under, like 14 or 13. Yeah, teenagers. So I will show you now a video that is the reading of the names in the school, which is part of the work. I show it when I show the whole body of work. I show the videos too. And we will get back to the photographs afterwards.
Leonardo Achiman, Claudio Adur, Enrique Jorge Agio, Luis Daniel Eisenberg, Eduardo Horacio Beckerman, Amado Berardo, Martín Elías Berkovich, José Daniel Bronzel, Luis Martín Burgúa, Jorge Donato Calvo, Horacio Domingo Campiglia, Mirta Cancela, Norberto José Castillo, Ramón Gerardo Cesaris, Augusto María Ponce McDonnell, Silvia Coraza, Román Mentaverri, Horacio Oscar Mérega, Carlos Mujica, Jorge Nakamura, Carlos Guillermo Campo, Carlos Olmedo, Eduardo Miguel O'Neill, Beatriz Pajela Raya, Guillermo Pajela Raya, Patricia Palazuelo, Alberto José Pargamén, Hugo Félix Prieto, Julio César Provenzano, Enrique Raab, Carlos Ramos, Raúl Rinaldi.
Okay, so that was the reading, and you could see that everybody raised a picture when the name was mentioned, and those pictures are also somehow part of the exhibition. So we're back here, and this was shown in the school in the exhibition. I also looked for the photographs of the missing, which I couldn't find. We have 112 missing from our club, from my school. And this was Claudio, the other friend of mine. I had these pictures in my personal album of a teenager. So when I showed it in the school, where my daughter is now attending, we had this communication with the students. This is 96, 22 years ago. Now the class picture is permanently displayed in the school as part of the history of the school. So we had this situation of conversation between generations in which, through the images, the younger students could understand in a way what had happened with us in the same school in other circumstances. So they could somehow identify or understand that it could have happened with them, which is true. But fortunately, we judged the military. We judged the military in Argentina. So the human rights movement achieved this result, and so it won't happen again. I hope so. The rabbi, a friend of mine, says everything happens again, but we'll see. So this is like a more family part of the essay. When I'm going on camping with my friend, this picture of Martin taking a picture of mine. I'm as a young photographer. So it's now, and with these images, I tried to somehow build the portrait of my missing brother, Fernando. Dot, who introduced me, has written an essay about the picture of my brother in the concentration camp and other victims that were shot there. These are one of the few images of people in concentration camps there are. We have 11 of them in Argentina. One of them is of my brother. So here it is in a theater. This is a picture taken by my mother. This is one of the first pictures I ever took, and it also has a text attached to it that I can read. So this is the book that contains this essay, and it is the most important book I made, and it is in the photo book A History by Martin Parr, and it is responsible for making this show go around the world for many years, 150 times. The books in photography and in art are absolutely essential. They are totally different from the web because you can have a more intimate relationship with what is being said. So Fernando, this picture of my brother is one of the first I took in my life with an antique camera my dad gave me. We are in the room we shared. His face is blurry. His movement, today non-existent, diffuses him before the lens. The photographs on the wall, however, bear the lengthy exposure better. It's the best picture I have left of him, of when we lived together. The text in Spanish of 1968 says, a picture of Fernando in a room, taking with the eumig on bulb. He is still and motionless for a minute. This connection between the caption and the photograph are part of the work, and for me are relevant because they add layers of meaning to the exhibition, to the photograph and to the work. And this one is also interesting in terms of the text. Although it's not part of the show, it's part of the book. You can read there, peace is strength. That is a monument to Bolivar, one of the independence leaders of South America. So it says, Nando in the park. Our house was across from Park Rivadavia, where we used to play. Fernando, really a teenager, and with his hands in his pockets, passes before a youth power graffiti that says, peace is strength. In the marble, the scene of an oath. Why is Bolivar blindfolded with a handkerchief? And why does an Argentine flag hang from his horse's neck? Justice, the sword, blindness, history, power, peace and strength turn around my brother in a strange game of premonitions. Okay, so these are the pictures I use to bring him back in a way. And these also have their texts attached. And this is the last one I will read about. This comes from Super 8 film made by my father, who is now 95. And it's a series of film stills from a Super 8 film he shot, probably in 1966 or something. We are at Billy's weekend house. My brother is on the left and I am on the right. We pretend to kill each other with bows and arrows. The arrows hit their marks precisely. We fall clumsily to the ground and die almost at the same time, though I die first. We could not guess that in just 10 years, one of us would really die. 22 is no age to die. When at 12 we pretended to die, we thought we were immortal. Okay, so this is Good Memory, the first memorial I made about him with these pictures you saw before, heroes and family that come together to create family heroes. A sculpture my mother made of him. My mother was an artist too. She died 2 years ago. And the essay ends with this picture of the brother of my grandfather arriving to America. We call ourselves America as well. This is crossing the river, Uncle Salomon, my brother and myself crossing the river on a weekend to Uruguay. It says there in this board, it is forbidden to remain in this place, but unlike Canadians with Latin America, don't follow the signs. And this is the final photograph of the essay, and it says, into the river they threw them, it became their non-existing tomb. So that's the picture of my brother in the camp. So this is Good Memory. I will show you a little bit of Nexo, which is another work I made. I mean, Good Memory had a lot of impact, and I had the need to continue with this work, and this is more abstract. It refers to the vanishing of the symbols. It is an actual fountain with water flowing. And analogy, this is an analogy about a war in 17th century in Italy and something similar in Argentina, how we went through the 20th century. So these are, let's say, conceptual pieces. X, that refers to exilio, to exile. These are some pictures of exile in Barcelona in the early 80s. The keys. There are many people from all over here, so they probably have some keys from the house they left, and that's mixed with the house they now have. And that's what this picture tries to show, the mixture. A portrait of an exiled friend, impossible to identify, the family I had at the time, and burning objects as part of somehow born again in a new place. That's part of, you have to kill part of the past somehow. Well, this picture can be read as ever, however you want. And this is a self-portrait being shot that I took in a square in Barcelona where Franco used to shoot during the Civil War in Spain. And that's another picture of my friends also dramatizing a shooting session in a beach in Argentina. So probably now I have to show you a bit of the consequences the park had on my life in a way, because after we organized this event in the school, we had an initiative first to create a monument in our school with all the names of the victims. This monument was made by a sculptor, and we had all the names that you heard in the video written on bronze in the school. So then we came up with initiative to create a memorial park with all the names of all the victims of the dictatorship, not of the school. And we presented this to the human rights organizations, and that was approved by a law. So we created this place with all the names of the victims, which has a gallery space and all the names in granite of the Patagonia, and the age of the victim, and when they are pregnant, because you know that many people were kidnapped when they were pregnant, the women, and they kept the children and killed the mothers. So there is a whole search in Argentina about these children. We've found already 115, and we're still looking for 300 of them. And this is a memorial place where we, as Dot said, receive visitors from all over the world, artists, scholars, leaders, and they throw flowers to the river to remember the victims of the dictatorship. So this is something very important for us, and it's a very strong symbol of the fact that we could remember them, and that's not vanished in amnesia. Okay, so people throw flowers to the river, and that's a tradition. There are events and all sorts of acts and a space where we have the park and the sculptures that were built. This was by William Tucker. Okay, so this is the sculptures we have there. And this is probably the most stronger one. It's floating on the river, and it is the image of a missing student that was 14 when he was kidnapped, same age as the artist who is called Claudia Fontes. So this is like a public part of my activity. This is a collective initiative. I'm just part of a broader group of people that make this work. We have a staff, a curator, and everything. Okay, so that came to life. It is a very important, probably the most important project I've ever been involved in. So then we have the 1968 work. This started when I was in 2014. We had the kidnapping of 43 students in Mexico. You know, the case of Ayotzinapa, a very famous case in which 43 students from a rural school in Guerrero State were kidnapped and disappeared in Mexico by gangs, the state, and drug dealers, everything mixed. There's a new investigation going, but there's no explanation yet. So I related that event with the previous massacre of Mexican students in 1968 called the Tlatelolco massacre, which was a big killing of 250 students or so in the Square of Three Cultures in central Mexico City, and that was never judged. So I wrote on that picture, if Tlatelolco would have been judged, Ayotzinapa wouldn't have happened, and that brought me to 1968, and I stayed there, worked around 1968 in the world. So these are pictures from Amsterdam and the Provo movement that is starting there. It's a countercultural movement that I later dedicated a full body of work to it and showed it in Amsterdam last year. So this is the German movement in '68, Rudi Dutschke, their leader, and the protagonist of the opera that Dot mentioned to you in our theater, our opera theater, an opera about '68, and he was our main character in the opera. This is Bangladesh, the 1971 independence process. I remember that today I spoke with somebody on the power plant about Bangladesh, and this was more or less at the same time. Beirut. It's very difficult to find images of the Arab world in the 60s. I was looking for images of Tunis. I couldn't get them yet. There's a big control on image circulation in certain areas, Africa and the Arab world in particular. It's been difficult, but as I had a picture agency for 30 years called Latin Stock, and that was my lifetime, let's say, professional work, I know the archives and how to reach images in hidden places, and it's a research. So all this work starts with a research about an image. I have to look for this image around the world or wherever I can find it. This was from the American University in Beirut. And it's not an image, an actual photograph, but it is the cover of a magazine, as you can see here. It is published in a magazine. It's the only way in which I could find this image in the library of the university, but at least there was something showing the events in Tunis, in Beirut, in Lebanon, and they are happening all over again today. Of course, as they are happening in Chile as well and all over. So this is related to '68, but it is also certainly related with today. This is Bogota, at the beginning of the civil war in Bogota, of the revolutionary movement in the jungle and these people in the streets. This was 68. This is Bonn. This is very interesting visually speaking because the picture shows the two events in 68. The Saigon shooting of a Viet Cong fighter by the chief of police of South Vietnam in the billboard, and the event in Bonn in Germany, West Germany then, when they were fighting against the war in Vietnam, which was certainly one of the major issues of mobilization in the world in 68. So we have this iconic image of Vietnam, which became one of the two most known images of the Vietnam War, this one and the naked young woman after a napalm bomb was thrown. It's also, I mean, you probably remember that image, or you don't, I don't know. It's part of visual culture, remembering or not certain images. But this one is probably quite known. And certainly contemporary artists, like for instance, Vic Muniz from Brazil, have transformed this into another, let's say, piece built about his remembering of the image. He recreated the image just through what he remembered about it. This is Chicago. 68, the Democratic Convention, also a war against Vietnam. It has something funny in it that I recognized when I was working on the image. Here it says, God is alive and well in Argentina. I don't know whether they knew that we would have a pope, or it was referred to a fascist leader hiding there. There are several theories about how and why God was alive in Argentina then. But there are details in the photographs that you cannot see at first sight, but when you work with them, the images have the power to tell the story in a different way than text, because they open up different interpretations, and you can go into the details however you want, and go as deep as you can. And you can go very deep, because you start wondering about them, asking for instance, here, let's say, free speech, student power, free speech. You go to Google what the free speech movement was, and you know that it was created in San Francisco. There was a big movement of students in San Francisco for free speech. They stop over the cars. You can start knowing a lot about the time with one image. This is Córdoba, El Cordobazo, our main insurrection in 1969 in Córdoba, Argentina. This is Belgium. Lithuania. This is a picture from the KGB, from the Soviet intelligence service. That's why the students are numbered to be recognized afterwards. This comes from the national files of Lithuania, that when it became independent, it kept all the images of the KGB in their files. So as I was invited to show my work in Lithuania, I said, okay, we have to do something here, and they looked for this image in their national files. This is Mexico. As I mentioned to you, Tlatelolco is present all the time. This is precisely part of the process of Tlatelolco, a march with the students of the authorities of the university. This is Munich. Paris, of course, used to be considered the center of it all, but it was just part of it all. But that's not necessarily a problem to the French. When I show this in France, they liked that they were surrounded by a bigger social movement. There was no internet at that time, but ideas spread anyway by different means. And this is the Cultural Revolution in China, the Red Book, also at the time, a totally different China than today, of course. Prague, Rio de Janeiro, against the dictatorship. We are now having a revival of the dictatorship in Brazil, so things turn around and go back and forth. This is Chile. It looks like a very pacific demonstration when we compare it with what is happening today in La Plaza de la Dignidad in Santiago. Every day, every Friday. Today, Wednesday. The day after tomorrow, there will be thousands of people in the streets fighting with the police in Santiago. Yesterday was a new victim. So this is Sydney and the native Australians heading a march in which they are showing, in 1972, the indigenous flag for the first time in the streets. This was for the first time, when they created this flag. And the text explains how and who created the flag. So all the text adds, as I read to you before, information about each image. In this case, it is also an image of the intelligence service. That is why, again, every student has a number. You can see the numbers in the picture. And I got this picture because there was a television production company in Australia that made a television series, one of the trendy ways in which video is now becoming massive, and they interviewed several of these students, now older people, and asked them what happened in their lives as a consequence of this. So I could get this image from the Secret Service of Australia through the production company in Sydney. This is Japan. Every image has an author. This is Toronto. So this image, for instance, was shot by a Canadian-Serbian photographer, Boris Spremo. There was a chance that I had an exhibition here in Canada, which didn't happen, but I started working on that possibility, and the Art Gallery of Ontario helped me to reach this photographer, Boris Spremo, who had been shooting in '68 here. This is City Hall, and these are all the American objectors that didn't want to go to war, that are occupying the square. I hand color every single piece. I do several of each, but each one is made by hand. And so you can read here. And Canadian complicity with the war, in the war in Vietnam, American war objectors, let's stop research for war, boycott Yankee war machine. Well, this was here in the city. So I didn't know much about Canada in '68, of course, but when I got the picture, I learned a lot. Unfortunately, Boris Spremo, who I never met, I licensed his picture, and as in every author put his name in the work, died last year. So, but at least as a photojournalist, he had a chance that his work circulates in the art world in a different way. Many photojournalists are totally forgotten, but this is another way in which their image might have a new life. This is Washington, a few months before Martin Luther King was killed. This is his lieutenant, Ralph Abernathy, who is the right hand of King. And this was a big march in Washington, the Poor People's March, in which they went beyond, let's say, African Americans and called for Latin Americans, whites, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans. Like Martin Luther King spread his scope into a Poor People's March, and a couple of months after, he was shot dead in the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis while he was giving a speech. This is Switzerland, one of the few, let's say, public protests in Switzerland, but it did happen. Okay, so this is a selection of images of my 1968 work. I will now show you more recent work. This is work that I made on Africa, because I had this show in Lisbon, and they commissioned me to work on Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea, the colonies of Portugal in Africa. So I started looking at Africa. This is a picture that is part of a collaboration I made with South African photographer Gideon Mendel. He has been shooting there in the 80s. This is a picture of Nelson Mandela sculpting a stone in a prison where he had been imprisoned for a long time, several years, 12 years, I believe. But then the intervention quotes his speech and transforms the stone into the African map. So it is a mixture of visual elements. Sculpting Africa is the title. This is Dakar. Senegal in the 68 also. Very difficult to find images there because the people that, the president then, Leopold Sédar Senghor, a poet, who ordered this repression, is like the national hero of Senegal, and nothing can be said about him because he's like the père de la patrie, quelque chose comme ça. I don't know. Congo? No, Sudan, sorry. Zimbabwe, sorry, Zimbabwe. Guinea. So this is also a visual and a textual approach to memory and how it is told. And these are a series of triptychs I've made on the South African struggle against apartheid, and this, as it is in collaboration with another artist, we both sign these pieces together. Then there is more to choose from. So each piece has two images of the situation. This is one of the triptychs, and this is the detail of the struggle in South Africa. Everything has details. I could speak, as Dot said, she could speak 1 hour about me. I don't know, I'm not sure. But I could speak a long time, probably 20 minutes about this, but I will only speak one, and it is that the only gatherings, I mean, I didn't know anything about this. Only through researching the images and producing the work and visually getting information about what is going on, you start learning about it. And more visuals are central to tell any story, because if there are no images, younger people won't pay any attention to the story. So the importance of images is becoming essential to transmit experience. Without images, people won't just pay any attention. They go to something else that does have images. Therefore, the importance of archives and of the capacity to tell, narrate a story with images is essential if we want to transmit any experience to the younger generations. So here, the funerals were the only opportunity in which the people could get together. So they ate, after the burial, they ate a deer, some kind of African deer, and each funeral became an occasion for a new action, and new people were killed, and a new funeral. So these are all scenes of funerals, of people killed for their fight against apartheid. In this case, you can see, you can read, my father, Chief Ampia Magisa, was murdered by vigilantes for his fight against forceful removal of our community. In this case, I get this information from the photographer himself, but you can see some traces of other pieces of information that you can put together. And this photographer, who is also mentioned here, was very important part of the Big Band, a group of journalists that worked in South Africa. Okay, each thing has a story. And the story has an image. So I had the opportunity to show this work in Johannesburg, in the Apartheid Museum. I've never been there, but my work has. I'll probably have a show next year in Cape Town, and that, through the images, there is a connection with the space. I'm already somehow in conversation with the South African art and visual scene without being there ever, through the intervention and the action and the human rights, let's say, vision of what went on there by interacting with the images and creating a narrative about it that is in conversation with their own narrative. It's a different one because I come from a different background. Gideon Mendel, who is a Jewish photographer who was there in the 80s, has a problem because he's white, and being white in South Africa is a problem. But I'm Argentinian, no problem. So this is another work about migration. This is what I'm showing next week, in fact, in the Hood Museum in Dartmouth University in New Hampshire, not very far from here. So this is my grandmother when she was in Ukraine, then the Russian Empire, and she's saying, I'll do my life on the other side of the world in the Pampas. But she is here also in a class picture, the class picture of her classmates of the Russian language in a little town of Kakhovka in Ukraine before she left. This is 1808. 1908. She arrived to Argentina in 1914. So we had immigrants even before Canada, not as many as you do now, but in the beginning of the 20th century, after the US, Argentina received most immigrants from all the world. So this is she again in Russia. This is a reference to this migration in which I identify myself as a grandson of immigrants. This is my grandmother in Russia, certainly, not in Argentina. And this is also a reference to her culture. Chekhov, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all her references in the language. Now, back when she arrived to Argentina, this is her with my father as a child. And again, the picture being shot that you saw in Nexo, which refers, in this case, I am the grandson of immigrants. In this case, I am an immigrant in Barcelona. And in this one, it's a reference to the current situation of migration in Europe. These are images I licensed from a press agency, EFE from Spain. These are Syrians arriving to Greece. Only, this is 216, but this could be a couple of weeks ago. And it's called Madonna of Piraeus. It also has the text. This is also a group of immigrants that gets to a rock in a Spanish colony in Morocco, so in a low tide they can walk there, and they are in Europe. That's why they are making this party. Lampedusa. Where are we going? Okay, so with this, we have a panorama of what I'm doing. So I think that I finish and we'll have a conversation with Dot.